Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're going to continue our study in the book of Philippians. Last week we ended up in verse 7. Today we're going to study verses 8 through 13. What we saw in the last few verses is that there may be occasional outbreaks in our life that cause anxiety. We talked about not having anxiety last week as if it were nothing, but these two verses 8 and 9 is what we're starting with. These two verses speak to an orderly personal environment to prevent such outbreaks. In other words, do not put yourself in a position which can lead to anxiety. How simple. That's all you got to do. Just don't put yourself in that position. Actually, here, there are two lists that we're going to look at. Let me read verses 8 and 9, chapter 4. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, this is a very interesting list because of what it says we're to do. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. It doesn't say to do those things. It says to think about those things. So let's keep going. Maybe we can figure out what's being talked about here. And there's two lists. That's one list. The other list is in verse 9. Let me read verse 9. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So that's how you have peace. If you can have peace, you're not going to have anxiety. So what we have here is two lists for our review. There are things in verse 8 that we are to think on. And when I say think on, I mean ponder and give deep thought to. It's not just a matter of, oh yeah, I know what all that stuff is, let's move on. I mean, think on these things. Ponder them. Come to an understanding of what it's talking about. The other list, I think, is very interesting as well. Is things to put into practice. And these are, this list is learned. It says, let me read it again. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice. That's Paul writing. Remember, he's in prison, he's writing, and he's telling them to do those things. So in other words, he's saying, live like I do. I'm your example. I live like Christ. You are to live like me. Okay, so look at these and think on things which have these qualities. Now, what we're trying to do is order our environment where we live in peace and where we're able to control anxiety, possibly even not have any anxiety. That's the goal. So what we're going to talk about here is get control of ourselves, basically, get our life in order where we have these things that we're going to think on, and also to put into practice. As we see there's two lists here. So let's look at the first list. Both Christian. Let me just before we go through this list item by item, I want to mention that both Christians and non-Christians can have these qualities. But with slight variances, obviously, because Christ is in one and not in the other. Okay, so let's look at, I said the first one on my list is noble. Think on things that are noble. We need to be respectable. We need to do things that gain respect for ourselves. Don't be living your life in such a way that people are saying, "Ew, I don't like the way he's living. He's calling himself a Christian." Um, and on a daily basis, you may be thinking on these things in different ways. For example, on some days, you may be living in a way that causes people to look at you as a noble person, an honorable person. Other days, you may be looking at ways to relate to people in such a way that you find them noble and honorable. I'm saying ponder these things. Think about how it is day by day you're supposed to be doing things and ordering your life. How about right? Whatever is right. Think on these things. Whatever is right. If you look at the King James, it says just. Whatever is just. Now, what I think of, when we think of right or just, we think of what is fair. Being pure or holy in relation to God, that is something that I feel like I need to say something a little extra about. When I say right, the NIV says right. The King James says just. Whenever I hear those two words in the same sentence, just and right, I think of God who is just and righteous. Now, when we throw righteous into the mix, we have got a little bit different way of looking at things than just being right. Okay, can we be just and be righteous at the same time? Have you ever thought about that? When the Bible uses the word right, I think of the word righteous, which adds even another dimension to the things that we're to think on. Can we be right? Can we be righteous at the same time? We're just mere mortals here, but we are saved mortals. We're mortals that are supposed to be living like Christ. So if the Bible says think on things that are right, could we glean from that it means think on these things that are righteous? Because right from a secular standpoint can be something that is different than being righteous from a Christian standpoint. Okay, and if you were going to a court of law, well, you might lose from the standpoint of being righteous because the courts are secular and they look at things as being right. So I'm just saying it's things that's on the list to think about. So you need to think about right and righteous, or just and righteous, just and right, as you go through your list. And it brings God into it, the God of the Bible. Now, when I say I think of God as being righteous, I'm talking about my understanding of God as he is described in the Bible, with the characteristics that we know about that the Bible expounds on. And so that broadens how we're to ponder on the things in this list. He's the God of the Bible, not of the God of our own design. You know, you can be talking to somebody about this list and they can say, oh yeah, God, I know God. And if they were to describe God, you might be surprised at some of the things you hear. They don't really talk about the judgment part of God and the just part of God. They talk about him being a God of love. That's about all you're going to get from him. Well, there's more to it than that. That's not his only characteristic. But that's how the world sees right. When they think of God, they're thinking he's just a God of love, so therefore he must love me and he's not ever going to punish me. So it's definitely something to think on. All right, just and right. And when right gets into the mix, you got to start thinking, does it really mean righteous? You have to think on it, ponder it. come to some conclusions in your own mind about it. How about lovely? That which calls forth love. We need to be lovable. How about admirable? It's only here in the New Testament, and it means praiseworthy or attractive. How about excellent? They're worthy of praising God. The Christian world does not have a lock on this. This morally excellent is what I'm talking about. Think on things that are excellent. I'm talking about morally excellent. What I'm saying is the Christian world does not have a lock on that. Morally excellent. In fact, sometimes it's very difficult to see a difference in the way a Christian lives morally and compared with the average secular person in the way they live morally. So you need to think on that. That's what the list says. Think on these things. Think on moral excellence. What does that mean to you? How do you bring that into your life? Because, one of the things I said, if you can get these things working in your life, it may create an environment where you're going to have less stress and feel less anxiety. You're going to live more in peace. So you need to be thinking about these things. Don't be thinking about things that are going to put you out there kind of away from your Christian values. It's just going to add more stress to you. So just be thinking on these things. Think on these things. Well, these characteristics present a good testimony to the world. Of course, they are all in relation to Christ. In verse 9, Paul makes it clear that Christians should not allow the unbelieving world to guide their ethical decisions. We live, like it or not, we live in a secular world. And in so doing, we are exposed to secular values. And this list that we're reading from and being told to think on and ponder on should be able to give us some strength and some fortitude, maybe, to not let the values of the secular world creep into our lives. It's one of the things Paul's talking about. In verse 9, he makes it clear that, let's see, I think I just said that they should use a specifically Christian witness as a guide for correct moral conduct. All right. Now, in verse 9, let me read verse 9 again. Verse 9, that was the second list. The first list was to think on these things. Verse 9 says, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice. The other stuff was stuff we're to think about and figure out. This says, Paul says, do these things. You've seen me the way I live, and you heard me, you've seen me, you've learned from me. And the fourth one was, what was the fourth one? Received from me. It's a model for living. It's a model for living. Do these things, which is disciplined thought, and the God of peace will be with you. That's what it said in the very last of that verse. And if you do these four things, the God of peace will be with you. So that's what we're looking for, creating an environment for peace so that we'll have less anxiety in our lives. Okay? And Paul says if you do these four things, you will have peace of God. Okay, anxiety when anxiety appears, the cure is prayer. When life is disorderly, the cure is mental and practical discipline disciplined through Christ. All right, let's look at verse 10. Verse 10. These verses now, 10 through 13, is, I find, really interesting to teach them this way, because it's got Philippians 4:13 in there. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the reason I like to teach it in context is because of the way that verse has come into use. We make it to be a catch-all for all kinds of things, when there's really a specific meaning to that verse that applies under certain conditions. And we're going to talk about that as we go through these verses. So let's look at verse 10. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me, and renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. The first thing I see on that, he said, I rejoiced. What did he say back in verse 4? Rejoice in the Lord always. Now what he said, rejoice in the Lord always. Paul is in prison. He starts verse 10 by saying, I rejoiced. Not only that, but I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern, so on and so forth. Okay, but he said you should rejoice always. I rejoiced. I'm in prison. I rejoiced. And that's going to take us on into the rest of the verse. Once again, Paul is rejoicing in the Lord as he did in verse 4. Only this time he rejoices magnanimously, greatly, he says. In verse 4, he exhorted them to rejoice. Here he says he did just that. He exhorted them to rejoice. I practiced what I preached. I rejoiced. Clearly, Paul's joy is expressed in the Lord. They have renewed their concern. He says they have renewed their concern. I want you to pick apart a couple of these words so we understand what's really happening here. He said, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last, finally, at last, you renewed your concern for me. Now, what does that word renew mean? Renew means, it means that you had something, then you stopped it, then you started again. You had concern. He said you had finally you renewed your concern for me. So if you renewed your concern for him, it means you were concerned for him at one time. Then you got to a point where it looked like you were not concerned by him, and then you renewed it, and you got back to showing concern for him. You were concerned for him, and for some reason you stopped. It looked like you stopped being concerned, and then you renewed your concern for him. So that's the process of renewal. You started one way, you stopped it, and then you renewed it, and you came back to the original way. All right, and that way was being concerned for him. In the key verb in the epistle is proneo. Paul uses it consistently to point out proper Christian attitudes in fellowship, in following the mind of Christ. All right, that's what he's talking about, concern. Paul says they renewed, and he says at last. Makes it sound like, man, I was hoping for it and you just didn't do it. Finally, at last, you're showing concern for me. Showing concern again. Some time has passed since they gave support for him. So I think they were one of the few churches that were actually giving financial support to Paul. And for some reason, they got sidetracked on that. We're going to see what happened. and now they're getting back to it. It sounds like a mild rebuke, finally. But he goes on to say that they had no opportunity, meaning no occasion to give or to give support or concern. Okay? So he's not rebuking them. He's saying, I understand. You were, and then you got into this situation where you couldn't, and there was no occasion for you to do it. So Paul understands that. He's not rebuking them. It does sound that way, though. I will admit that. Paul said he knew they were concerned for him, just no occasion to show it. Paul is not reflecting on his own need, but we will see later that he wants them to be blessed. Paul is about to give a list of 3 reasons he fared well even without their gifts. Verse 11, I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Now, this is part of the context that we're going to read through, getting to verse 13, Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This is part of the context. He says, I'm in need. No, he said, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Well, what are his circumstances? He's in jail. And he's not sitting there saying, oh, pitiful me, why'd you do this to me, God? He's in jail rejoicing. Not rejoicing, not tickled to death that he's in jail. He's rejoicing knowing that God is in control. All right, so let's keep going. He says, just see, I have something here I want to say in verse 11. It says that he learned to be content. That's a big deal. Bigger than you probably would notice if you're if you're just reading through this. It's not something that you would just, it's probably something you might just read over, but it says that he learned. He learned to be content. You know, we've talked about the spiritual gifts that we get. It says you get them when the Holy Spirit gives them to you when you are saved. And I'm saying one of them is joy, and that's the one I like to think about. So, well, if that's one of my gifts that I get from the Holy Spirit, why don't I feel it? It's because you have to learn how to claim it. All of those gifts, you have to learn how to access them and how to claim them. Paul is saying he learned how to be content. Do you see where I'm going with this? He learned how to do it. He might have been at one time might have been sitting there saying, oh man, I'm in jail again, you know. But that's not how he is. In fact, he's never been that way. He knows that God is in his life, God is in control, and if he's in jail, he's there for God's purpose. And because of that, knowing he's there for God's purpose to be fulfilled, he can be content. So let's keep going. We will see in Philippians 4:13 his strength to do certain things in which he is called by Christ comes through Christ. He's called by Christ and it comes through Christ. In that regard, he does not need help. So Paul is content in all things, knowing that Christ is in control. He's called him to do certain things, and if he's called him, he's going to give him the strength and the resources to get it done. We're not there yet. We'll talk about it in a minute. Let's look at verse 12. I know what it is. Now, this is interesting. Paul is going to give us a comparison of 2 things. The first one, he says, I've been there and I've not been there on each one of these things. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. All right? He learned it. He learned the secret of being content. He's adaptable. It's a fairly long verse, and it's well directed in its meaning. Paul is adaptable. He gives the contrast of need and plenty. Those are physical attributes. He's been well fed and hungry, both. He's had plenty of food and not plenty of food. He's been full and hungry uh, as a part of his life, not for one day, but as living his life out. He's had times of plenty, and he's had times of real need where food is concerned. He's had plenty and want, and that's poverty and riches and finances. He's had plenty of dough. Just to remind you where Paul came from, he was a Pharisee, and that means at one time in his life he was wealthy. And we talked about that, not to a great extent, but we covered some of those characteristics that Paul had that he lost. Remember, we talked about he counts everything but lost. We went through the things that he lost. One of them was dough, money. He had plenty of money. He didn't have it anymore. He lost his family. He lost many things. He lost family by their choice because he became a Christian, and they rejected him because of it. And several things there. But here's what he's talking about. He's talking about having stuff and not having stuff. Okay. So it's contrast that he's talking about. He can rise above any set of circumstances. I feel compelled to point something out here. We get this feeling that Paul is poor. I think I just went through this. I'm not going to do it again. I was going to tell you about him. I got out of order in my notes, and that's what sometimes makes my lesson get a little bit long. We talked about him having money when he was a Pharisee. He was wealthy, and that's probably one of the times that he's talking about here, when he had plenty of money. Doesn't have it now, but he's content nevertheless. I also mentioned his family. We talked about that back in that other lesson. Lost his family by their choice when he became a Christian. So Paul had it all except eternal life. He didn't have eternal life. That's the thing. He denied himself. He took up his cross daily to follow Christ, no matter what the cost. If you're going to become sanctified, it means you're becoming like Christ. The only way to become like Christ, is to take up your cross daily and follow him. Okay, if you don't do that, it's the only way you can become like him is to worship him. And you will become, I've talked about this in one of my lessons in Hosea, that you will become, I think it's, I wish I could remember the reference, 7 verse 10 or 9 verse 10. You're going to become like the things that you worship. If you worship a God of love, you're going to become loving. If you worship a God of money, you're going to be cold and greedy and that sort of thing. So yes, he has known plenty, and now he knows want. He had plenty, now he knows want. He has nothing to eat. He's in prison, and he has learned how to be content through his experience. That's the way we learn some things, is by experience, and that's how Paul has learned these things. He's learned he can count on Christ to get him through. If Christ calls him to do something and he's in Christ's will, he will not necessarily be successful by the world's standards, but he will be successful according to the purposes that Christ laid out for this calling that he has for Paul and for us. So let's look at verse 13. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Well, I don't like that wording. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's the way I like it. I was reading the NIV. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's King James. Okay. Let's say there's a 2,000-pound boulder over there that I'm going to move under God's strength that he's going to give me to move it to impress my friends. So I walk over to that 20,000-pound boulder and I can't move it. I thought it was a promise. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Let's say, here's the example I used in one of my classes one time. There was a nice little girl in there. I didn't pick on her, but I did use her as an example. I said, suppose that God says, I want you to take these 10 chairs all at one time out of this room and take them to another room. May even have to take them upstairs. What are you going to do? She said, well, I can't do it. And as you're saying, I can't do it, two guys show up with big muscles and say, hey, we're here to move those chairs for you and help you out. We heard that God called you to do it. We're here to do it for you. Well, if you just decided to move those 10 chairs and God's going to give you the strength, well, he may not. But if he called you to do it, now this may be a facetious example, but it's not really, because we use this verse in some ways that are facetious. We've used it to get us through a test. I'm going to pass that test through the strength of Christ. Or I'm going to go to this job interview and God's going to get that job for me. Well, did he actually call you to take that test? Did he actually call you to get that job? I want to look at a verse. I think it's Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. It's not my words. That's what I just said, though. Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Man, I want to start this company and make $1 million. Well, did God call you to start that company? Does he want that to be your life's work? Or is it you just want to make a bunch of money? Something you have to think about. Is God really calling me to do thus and so? Maybe another verse I want to call your attention to. 16:9, maybe. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. He has plans for you. Maybe you've dreamed something up. You want to do this, and I'm going to ask God for his blessing on it. Well, you may get his blessing on it if you're asking for something that is in his will. Now, something else I want to say that you have to come to grips with, and that is, can you be content in all circumstances? What if you start that company, and I don't have anybody in mind, I don't know anything about you, you don't know anything about me, but if you feel really strongly that God is leading you to start this company, and you start it and you fail, I want you to think on that a minute. Is that God calling you to something, or is it you bringing your plan to God in the context of chapter 19:21, where he has a purpose for you, and the purpose may not have been to make a bunch of money. It may be something totally different. And then you find yourself saying, but I thought I was in God's will. Well, you may have been totally in God's will, but his purpose was not for you to make a bunch of money. So I want you to think on that verse, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What that means is you can do all things through Christ that Christ calls you to. If he calls you to something, he will provide the resources and the strength, whatever you need, okay, to accomplish the purpose. It may not be successful in the ways that you think of success or the way the world thinks of success, but to accomplish the purpose that Christ had set out for you, you will be successful. Well, I hope I didn't belabor any point there, but that's all that I have for you today. I want to thank you for being here and thank you for studying with me.